I'd like to try to be as positive as possible, since I have that reputation for being somebody who's willing to work. So let's be happy with the idea that the governor is making education a priority. That's a positive thing. The problem is that we have the worst school funding formula in the nation, by far. And on top of that, we have probably the worst state in the nation in terms of funding education from the state level. So the governor didn't really focus on changing the formula. We can't just spend more money with a broken formula, because we will end up with unequal outcomes. So we need to have a complete overhaul of the school funding formula. And the other important point is that we are not asking for any kind of a bailout for Chicago. It's not going to happen. I'm not in favor of a bailout for Chicago. I'm in favor of a funding formula and fairness. The governor is inaccurate to say that Chicago gets an extra $600 million. It's not true. The fact is that Chicago gets no money to speak of at all from the state for its pensions, whereas every other school district does. That should be corrected. Any special deals in the formula should be eliminated. There should be one formula for the whole state. And the goal of that change in the formula would be to focus education dollars where there's a concentration of poverty. And that will probably benefit not just Chicago, but also East St. Louis and Taylorville and other poor school districts. Now, the other thing that's very alarming is that the governor has basically proposed legislation that would allow him to raid monies from the pension funds, from the local government's money, to start the idea of skipping pension payments again when we have such a bad pension funding problem is the wrong thing to do. We haven't done that since Governor Blagojevich was here. And so Governor Rauner has proposed the Blagojevich move, which is really not a good idea. Instead, he should acknowledge that his budget is at least $3.5 billion out of whack, that we have said from the start, focus on the budget, not this unrelated turnaround agenda. The Speaker and I have been consistent. We're willing to talk to him about cuts, revenue, or a combination thereof. And he doesn't seem to be focused on doing that. Instead, he's asking for a turnaround agenda, which really has nothing to do directly with the state budget. He's proposing things which are really dramatic and radical compared to the idea of not having a budget for 8.5 months. We've indicated to him we're willing to talk about workers' comp reforms. Keeping in mind we passed a major workers' comp reform bill 4 years ago, and we've had dramatic cuts, almost 20% cuts in premiums. We've said we're willing to talk about collective bargaining issues, but not putting the unions out of business. I mean, he couldn't pass that in some Republican-dominated state legislatures. So the other thing that I think is kind of fundamental, if we pass a budget that the governor thinks is out of whack, he can mandatorily veto the budget. He can reduce the line items. And that's in the Constitution. So he has that authority to do it. He should have done it last year. Senator Berdogno, at his request, has introduced Senate Bill 2789, allows for skipping pension payments, raiding local government funds. It's not a good idea. We're more than halfway through a budget year with no budget. And now we're debating what could best be described as sketches for a budget for next year. So it almost wasn't a budget address.